The plate shattered against the cold diner floor like a sudden gunshot, spraying syrup in a dark, sticky arc that mirrored the cruelty exploding in the room. 12-year-old Maya sat frozen in her wheelchair, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrests, staring at the ruin of her breakfast, while 4 teenage boys laughed at her helplessness. Before you witness how a high-ranking female FBI agent turns this scene of humiliation into a masterclass in justice, hit that subscribe button and join our community of the brave. Comment below with the city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The crack of ceramic on tile split through the warm hum of the Sunset Diner, instantly killing every conversation, every clink of a spoon, and every low laugh. It was the kind of heavy, devastating silence that only follows a moment where something has gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. Maya did not cry. She wanted to. The burning behind her eyes was an almost physical weight, but she pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose, doing exactly what she had spent 3 years teaching herself to do in public. "Look at that mess," one of the boys sneered, his voice loud enough to claim the entire room's attention. "Does that thing have a horn? Or do you just beep beep when you're making a scene?" Maya kept her eyes locked on the window, watching the gray mist outside, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction, even as her fingers began to tremble against the cold metal of her chair. She had learned the hard way that when you are in a wheelchair and you cry in public, people don't see your pain. They only see your weakness. "I'm talking to you, Wheels." The boy leaned closer, his breath smelling of stale energy drinks and unearned confidence. "What happened? Were you born broken, or did you just forget how to walk?" "Please." Maya's voice was a whisper, a thin thread of dignity held together by sheer willpower. "Just leave me alone." The boy's face twisted into something mean and small, a look that mistook cruelty for power. "We're just being friendly. Can't you take a joke?" Then, with a casual, lazy flick of his hand, he slapped the edge of her new plate, sending it spinning into the air. The crash was followed by a shove so hard, it sent her rolling backward 2 feet, her heart lurching into her throat as the boys erupted into hysterical laughter. The diner sat frozen. A woman covered her mouth. A man looked at his phone and then quickly looked away, trapped in the awful silence of people who know something is wrong but cannot find the courage to speak. Maya slowly wheeled herself back to the table, her vision blurring at the edges because she was only 12, and she had just finished 2 hours of grueling physical therapy. She reached down, her fingers barely grazing a broken piece of the ceramic pitcher, her chest aching with a fatigue that went deeper than bone. "Sweetheart, let me." A steady hand appeared beside hers. An older gentleman knelt down without making a scene, gathering the pieces with a quiet recognition in his eyes that held no pity, only respect. "Don't you mind them," he whispered, setting the shards on the table before returning to his seat. Maya whispered a thank you, Chakti, but her heart was already searching the parking lot for the one person who could make the world stop hurting. She checked her phone. Her mother's message from 40 minutes ago read, "On my way, bug, 20 minutes out." She was supposed to be strong, the daughter of a federal agent, but the humiliation was burning in her chest, like something with teeth. Special Agent Elena Vance had spent 15 years in the FBI, a woman who had operated in the shadows of organized crime and looked genuine monsters in the eye without blinking. She had been 3 states away on a multi-agency task force the night the drunk driver changed their lives forever. She remembered the exact weight of the encrypted phone when the call came at 3 a.m. She remembered the way her world didn't break, but simply gave way, like a bridge holding too much weight. She had been at the hospital in hours, still in her tactical vest, walking down the corridor with a speed that was almost a run. Seeing Maya in that bed, surrounded by the indifferent beeping of machines, Elena had made a promise whispered into her daughter's hair. I will always come. No matter where I am, I will always come. As Elena turned her black SUV into the Sunset Diner parking lot 17 minutes later, she didn't know that today was the day that promise would be tested in front of a room full of strangers. She stepped out into the mist, wearing a plain leather jacket that hid her badge and her sidearm, but the way she moved told the story of a predator. She scanned the lot with a single, unhurried sweep of her eyes before opening the rear door. Ares, a Belgian Malinois with 80 pounds of muscle and tactical training, Steve jumped down and shook himself once, his harness settling across his broad chest. He had tracked fugitives through dense forests and cleared houses that Elena wouldn't send a human team into first. They walked toward the entrance, the bell chiming softly as they stepped inside. Ares stopped instantly. His ears came forward, his nose lifted, and for 3 seconds, he read the room the way only a soldier can. He felt the specific quality of the tension. He located the distress signal radiating from the corner of the room. Without a word from Elena, Ares moved past the hostess stand, past the counter, and straight toward the booth of teenage boys. The boys went rigid as the dog passed them, their laughter dying so suddenly it was as if a switch had been flipped. Ares didn't look at them. He moved in a straight, unhesitating line until he reached Maya, lowering his great head into her lap. Maya's breath caught. Her hands sank into his thick fur, feeling a heartbeat that was slow, steady, and completely unafraid. Ares made a low sound in his chest, a vibration meant only for her, and the tears Maya had been holding back finally fell. Elena stood 2 steps inside the door, her eyes taking in the syrup on the floor, the broken pitcher, and the way her daughter's shoulders were hunched in the posture of someone who has just survived an assault. Her gaze shifted to the booth next to Maya. The 4 boys were staring at her, their expressions shifting from confusion to a rising, urgent fear. Elena didn't rush. She walked to their table with the patient steadiness of a woman who never needed to raise her voice to command a room. Which one of you touched her plate? She asked, her voice quiet, heavy, and devoid of any doubt. The boys remained silent, but the air in the diner seemed to thin. I have spent my career reading people under extreme pressure, Elena said, her eyes locking onto the tallest boy. So before anyone says something that isn't true, understand that I will know. I will absolutely know. Ares lifted his head from Maya's lap, watching the boys with a calm, focused attention that was far more unsettling than a growl. Elena let the silence sit, letting the weight of their own actions crush them. My daughter worked for 2 hours this morning just to be able to sit in this chair, she said, her voice dropping an octave. She asks for nothing but a plate of pancakes, and you decided that was something to laugh at. Stand up, Elena commanded. It's now all of you. They stood, their bravado stripped away like cheap paint. Clean it up, she pointed to the floor. Every drop of syrup, every shard of glass. Now. The diners watched in a silence that was more instructive than any courtroom as the boys got onto their hands and knees, wiping the floor in front of everyone they had just tried to impress. When they finished, they stood before Maya, their faces pale and stripped of the performance. "I'm sorry," the leader whispered, his voice breaking as he finally saw the human being sitting in the chair. Maya looked at him, her hand resting on Ares' neck, and said two words that changed the temperature of the room again. "I forgive you." The boys blinked, nodded quickly, and retreated out the door as the diner finally exhaled. Elena pulled up a chair, sitting so her eyes were level with Maya's, a silent promise that she would never stand over her daughter. She wiped a tear from Maya's cheek. "How are you doing, Bug?" "Better," Maya smiled, a small, tired but real smile. "Now that you're here." Elena's hand remained steady on the table, but her heart was a storm of silent fury as she watched the boys scramble toward the exit, their pride discarded like the trash they had just been forced to clean. She didn't look at them. Her focus was entirely on Maya, whose small frame still trembled with the aftershocks of the confrontation. The older gentleman who had helped earlier gave Elena a knowing nod, a silent recognition between two people who understood the weight of a protective instinct. Maya's fingers were still buried in Ares' fur, and the dog remained a statue of calm, now his presence a literal anchor for the girl's drifting soul. "They're gone, baby," Elena whispered, her voice cracking just enough to show the mother behind the federal agent. Suddenly, the diner's heavy silence was broken not by a voice, but by a slow, rhythmic clapping from the back corner. It was Patty, the waitress, whose eyes were wet with a mixture of relief and indignation as she approached with a fresh tray. She set down a steaming plate of blueberry pancakes, the aroma of maple and butter cutting through the lingering tension like a peace offering. "On the house, sweetheart," Patty said, her voice thick with emotion as she looked at Maya. "Champions don't pay for their own victory meals." Maya looked at the golden pancakes, then at the empty booth beside her, into realizing for the first time that the monsters had been defeated without a single shot being fired. But as she picked up her fork, a shadow crossed Elena's face. The special agent's phone vibrated against the table with a persistence that signaled the outside world was already trying to claw its way back in. Elena glanced at the screen, her jaw tightening as she saw a restricted number that usually meant a mission was about to override her life again. She looked at Maya, who was finally taking a bite, the color returning to her cheeks, and for a split second, the special agent considered throwing the device into the remains of the syrup. Ares sensed the shift in Elena's energy and let out a soft huff, his ears twitching toward the door, as if he knew the peace they had just won was fragile. Maya noticed the look on her mother's face and stopped chewing, the old fear of abandonment flickering in her brown eyes. "Is it them, Mom?" she asked, her voice small, referring to the agency that had stolen her mother away so many times before. Elena silenced the phone and covered Maya's hand with her own, a silent vow that today the mission was right here at this table. The sun finally pierced the gray mist outside, flooding the diner with a sudden blinding light that made the ordinary world look like a place worth fighting for again. Maya took a deep breath, the heavy weight in her chest finally dissolving into something that felt like safety. The phone vibrated again, a jagged hum against the tabletop that seemed to mock the fragile peace they had just reclaimed. Elena felt the phantom weight of her badge pressing against her ribs, a reminder that her soul was never truly off the clock. Maya's fork hovered mid-air, her eyes darting from the screen to her mother's tightening jaw. You have to go, don't you? She whispered, the light in her eyes dimming as the familiar shadow of the bureau began to stretch across the table. Elena didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached out and flipped the phone face down, the silence that followed feeling heavier than the noise of the vibration. The only place I have to be is right here, watching you finish those pancakes, Elena said, though the steel in her voice was fighting a losing battle with the urgency pulsing in her pocket. Ares suddenly shifted, his low growl vibrating through the floorboards before the diner door even swung open. His hackles rose slightly, with eyes fixed on a man in a dark trench coat who had just stepped inside, scanning the room with a clinical, predatory precision that Elena recognized instantly. The man's gaze locked onto Elena's, and for a heartbeat, the air in the Sunset Diner turned to ice. He didn't move toward the counter, nor did he look at a menu. He walked straight toward their booth, his hand reaching into his inner pocket. Maya gasped, her grip tightening on the armrests of her wheelchair as her heart hammered against her chest, like a trapped bird. "Agent Vance," the man said, his voice a gravelly monotone that cut through the clinking of dishes. The director doesn't take no for an answer, especially not when the safe house has been compromised. Elena stood up slowly, her body shielding Maya with a mechanical instinct honed by years of combat. "I am on administrative leave, Miller, and if you take one more step toward my daughter, Ares will not wait for my command." The man stopped, his eyes flicking down to the Malinois whose teeth were now visible in a silent, terrifying snarl. The surrounding patrons froze, the coffee in their cups trembling as the tension reached a snapping point. "It's not about the mission anymore, Elena," Miller whispered, leaning in just enough so Maya couldn't hear, though the terror on her face suggested she understood the stakes perfectly. "They found the leak, and your name was at the top of the list." Elena felt a cold sweat prickle her spine. The hunter had become the hunted in the span of a single sentence, and the diner that felt like a sanctuary moments ago was now a glass cage. "Mom?" Maya's voice broke, a high, thin sound of pure dread. "What is he saying? Why are you looking at me like that?" Elena didn't look back. She kept her eyes on Miller's hands, her mind racing through exit strategies while her heart broke for the girl who just wanted a quiet Thursday. "Finish your breakfast, Bug," Elena said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of a final goodbye. "Ares, stay with her. Do not let anyone touch her." Before Maya could scream, Elena grabbed Miller by the collar and shoved him toward the kitchen exit, the violence of the movement shattering a glass on a nearby table. She wasn't just an agent anymore. She was a mother whose world was being set on fire, and she was ready to burn everything down to keep the flames away from her child. The kitchen door swung shut with a violent thud, leaving Maya alone with a growling dog and a room full of strangers who were realizing that the woman who saved them was running for her life. The kitchen door was still vibrating from the force of Elena's exit when the air in the diner shifted from frozen shock to a frantic, suffocating heat. The patrons were no longer just spectators. They were witnesses to a high-stakes betrayal that threatened to swallow them all. Maya stared at the swinging door, her breath hitching in her throat as she realized the woman who had just saved her was now the one in the crosshairs. "Mom!" she screamed, the sound tearing through the room like a jagged blade, but only the low, rumbling growl of Ares answered her. The dog stood his ground, his paws planted firmly on the floor beside her wheelchair. His eyes never left the entrance, his instincts screaming that the threat was far from over. Behind the counter, Patty reached for the phone, her hands shaking so violently she could barely dial. "Get back from the windows!" she yelled to the room, her voice breaking as she realized the glass walls of the Sunset Diner were nothing more than a fragile illusion of safety. A sudden sharp thud echoed from the kitchen, the sound of flesh hitting stainless steel, followed by the muffled roar of Elena's voice, raw with a desperation that Maya had never heard in all her 12 years. It was the sound of a mother who had stopped being an officer and had become a force of nature. "You think I'll let you take her?" Elena's voice drifted through the gap in the door, laced with a terrifying cold fury. "I've spent 15 years buried in the dirt for this agency. And you think you can frame me to cover your own tracks?" The revelation hit Maya like a physical blow. The leak Miller mentioned wasn't an accident. It was a setup, a calculated move to silence the only special agent who knew too much about the director's shadow operations. Suddenly, a second black SUV screeched into the parking lot, spinning on the wet asphalt and blocking the only exit. 2 men in tactical gear stepped out, their faces obscured by masks, moving with a synchronized lethality that made the previous teenage bullies look like children playing at war. Maya looked at Ares, her heart pounding against her ribs so hard it felt like it might burst. "Ares, go!" she sobbed. "Go help her." But the dog didn't move. He stayed locked in his command, his loyalty to Maya's safety competing with his desire to protect his handler. A silent battle of wills that played out in the tensing of his powerful muscles. Inside the kitchen, a tray of silverware crashed to the floor, followed by the sound of a window shattering. Miller's voice rose in a panicked shout. "She's going for the back alley! Don't let her reach the vehicle!" One of the tactical men at the front door kicked the glass open, the shards showering the floor in a diamond-like spray that sent the remaining diners screaming toward the floor. He didn't look at them, his suppressed rifle leveled directly at the kitchen door. Maya felt a surge of adrenaline that defied her broken legs. She grabbed the pitcher of water from her table and hurled it with every ounce of strength she possessed, the glass striking the gunman's shoulder just as he pulled the trigger. The shot went wide, splintering the doorframe, and in that split second of distraction, the kitchen door burst open. Not with Elena, but with Miller, who was stumbling backward, his face bloodied and his eyes wide with a sudden primal terror. Elena was right behind him, her leather jacket torn and her eyes burning with a light that looked like pure, unadulterated war. She didn't have a weapon in her hand. She had Miller's own tactical radio, and she was speaking into it with a calm that was far more frightening than a scream. "Every agent on this frequency knows the truth now," she whispered, her gaze shifting to the gunman in the doorway. "And if you fire that weapon, you aren't just killing a traitor. You're starting a civil war within the Bureau." The gunman hesitated, his finger hovering over the trigger, while the entire diner held its collective breath in a moment of absolute, terrifying suspense. The silence in the Sunset Diner was no longer the hen-hot silence of people ignoring a bully. It was the suffocating, heavy silence of a room where a single heartbeat could trigger a massacre. Elena stood in the center of that silence, her breathing shallow but controlled, her eyes locked on the gunman with a look that dared him to find his own soul before he found his trigger finger. The gunman's hand trembled. The red dot of his laser sight danced across the kitchen door, flickering over Elena's heart and then over the face of Miller, who was now weeping openly on the floor. His betrayal turned to a pathetic plea for mercy. "Drop the weapon, Cooper." Elena's voice was a low, melodic threat that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of his bones. "The feed I just sent out is already on the secure servers of the Internal Affairs Division. Every move you make now is being watched by the people you actually swore to protect." Maya grabbed the armrests of her wheelchair so hard the plastic groaned. She didn't look at the gunman. She only looked at her mother, seeing for the first time the true cost of the life Elena had chosen. The terrifying weight of a woman who stood between the world and the monsters it created. Ares suddenly let out a sharp, piercing bark, not at the gunman, but toward the SUV blocking the parking lot exit. And in that moment, the screech of tires echoed through the broken glass as a third vehicle, a nondescript white van, roared into the lot. The gunman, distracted by the new arrival, shifted his stance for a fraction of a second. Elena moved with the speed of a striking cobra, her foot connecting with his wrist and sending the rifle clattering across the tile toward Maya's wheels. "Ares, take him!" Elena screamed, and the Malinois was a blur of tan fur and fury, pinning the gunman to the doorframe before he could even reach for his sidearm. The diners erupted into a chaotic scramble, diving for cover behind the counter as the side door of the white van slid open. But instead of more tactical gear, out stepped a man with graying hair and an expression of profound, weary disappointment. "Director Vance!" Miller gasped from the floor, his voice a mix of terror and confusion. But the man ignored him, walking straight through the shattered doorway and toward the woman who had just dismantled his elite hit squad with a radio and a stare. Elena didn't lower her guard. Now she stood over the fallen rifle, her eyes cold enough to freeze the blood in the director's veins. "You came to finish it yourself, Arthur? Or did you just want to see the mess you made before the police arrive?" The director looked around at the broken diner, at the syrup-stained floor where Maya sat trembling, and at the dog who was currently the only thing keeping his operative alive. "I came to tell you that Miller acted without orders, Elena," the director said, though the lie felt thin and brittle in the charged air. "The agency has been compromised from within, and I needed to ensure you weren't the one holding the match." Elena laughed, a harsh, jagged sound that had no joy in it. "The only match being held is the one I just lit under your career, Arthur. The evidence I uploaded wasn't just about Miller. It was about the offshore accounts you used to fund this little cleanup crew." The director's face went pale, the mask of authority finally cracking to reveal the panicked old man underneath. He looked at Maya, his eyes lingering on the wheelchair, and for a second, a flicker of genuine regret passed through his expression. "You always were too good for this job, Elena," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant sound of approaching sirens. "You have a heart that this bureau was never meant to have." "My heart isn't at the bureau," Elena snapped, her voice breaking for the first time as she finally turned to look at Maya. "My heart is sitting in that chair, and you are never, ever going to touch it again." The sirens grew louder, a cacophony of red and blue lights beginning to dance across the wet asphalt outside. Yes, and as the local police flooded the diner, the high-stakes chess match finally ended in a total, devastating checkmate. Elena collapsed onto the bench beside Maya, the adrenaline leaving her body in a sudden, violent rush. She didn't care about the agents being handcuffed, or the director being led away in silence, or the diners who were now whispering her name with awe. She reached out and pulled Maya into her arms, burying her face in her daughter's hair, the smell of blueberry pancakes and rain finally replacing the scent of cordite and fear. "I'm sorry, Bug," Elena sobbed, her body shaking with the weight of every promise she had almost broken. "I'm so sorry I brought this to your Thursday." Maya pulled back just enough to look her mother in the eye. Her own face streaked with tears, but her spirit as unbreakable as the woman who raised her. She took her mother's hand and pressed it against her own chest, right over her heart. "It's okay, Mom," Maya whispered, her voice steady and filled with a wisdom that no 12-year-old should have to possess. "You said it yourself. The strength isn't in the legs, it's in here. And I knew you were coming because you always come." Ares trotted over, his tail wagging with a slow, dignified rhythm as he licked the syrup off Maya's hand. The warrior dog finally allowed to be a pet again, in a world that had momentarily remembered how to be kind. Patty walked over with a fresh pot of coffee, her hands still shaking, but her smile wide and proud. She poured a cup for Elena and set it down without a word, a silent tribute to the mother who had turned a diner into a fortress. The sun was now fully through the clouds, bathing the sunset diner in a golden light that made the broken glass on the floor look like scattered diamonds, a reminder that beauty can often be found in the aftermath of a storm. Elena looked at her daughter, at the dog at her feet, and at the community of strangers who were now standing together, realizing that the greatest power in the world isn't found in a badge or a gun. True justice isn't about the vengeance you take. It is about the love you are willing to protect at any cost.